David Beasley is the executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. He just returned from Ukraine and joins us from Washington. Hi, Mr. Beasley. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
My understanding is you just returned. I think it's your fifth visit from Ukraine. And more specifically, you were in Odessa. What did you see at the ports of Ukraine that underpin the food crisis, security crisis, the world is in right now?
Well, you know, Ukraine, what's happening there, this war is devastating, not just the people inside Ukraine, but when you realize that Ukraine grows enough food to feed 400 million people around the world, this is absolutely a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe, because the port of Odessa, that region, you're talking about massive amounts of food supplies that feeds the most vulnerable populations around the world. In fact, we feed about 125, 30 million people on any given day, week, and month, and half of our food comes from inside Ukraine. So you've got an internal problem with reaching the people inside Ukraine, and yet we're going to have a global crisis on food security, pricing over the next 6 to 9 months, and then the possibility of food availability problems next year.
Yeah, that timeline, I'm hoping you can dig into that for me a bit, because I think in more general terms, we've heard people say there's this crisis. It could affect you, in other countries. You're saying 6 to 9 months, we're going to see prices go up even higher, I should say, than they already are. And then
Yes.
We're looking at a lack of availability of food, period, next year. Is that accurate?
Now, what you're talking about is exactly right. You're already seeing food prices going up, up, up. Why? Because fuel costs are up, food pricing is up, shipping costs are up. In fact, Vassy, just on our operation alone, we're talking about a $70 million operational increase in cost per month, which means we will be feeding 4 to 5 million people less somewhere around the world. Now, here's our dilemma. The ports are not operating to move food supplies out. The silos where the farmers come out of the field from their harvest and put them in the silos, well, they're full because the ports aren't open. So the major harvest for Ukraine is going to be in July and August. And what's going to happen? Number one, the farmers are on the front lines right now fighting. Number two, if they do get into the fields, they probably can't get fertilizers. And number three, if they do harvest, where are they going to put it? Because the silos are full. So you're going to have an economic, agricultural collapse in Ukraine if we don't get those ports operational. And then number two, we're going to have a massive impact on food security in nations, in particularly the poorest countries around the world. The wealthy nations, it'll be an increased pricing. It'll be hard. But for the poorest of the poor, you're talking about famine, destabilization of nations, and number three, mass migration by necessity. And so we've got to get those ports operational. We've got to reach the people in need inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine.
If I hear you right, it's those ports that are key right now, among the other things you laid out. But I'm thinking of, okay, from the perspective, let's say, of Canadians watching or of other Western allies who are supplying already humanitarian aid and lethal aid to Ukraine. Clearly, it seems to me like there needs to be some sort of plan to get those ports open. What have you heard on that? What are your efforts to that effect? Yeah. And where do allies like Canada come in there?
Well, this is absolutely critical that the international community come together for the good of humanity, good of the world, that those ports become operational and we can move supplies, food supplies out of those ports to the rest of the world. That's why I've been down in Odessa jumping up and down, saying, hey, we got to protect these ports because it's critical, not just to Ukraine, but for the rest of the world. So the international community is going to have to voice with solidarity, protecting with neutrality the operations so that we can move ships through the seaways. There are 100 ships right now stuck in the area and nothing's moving. It's just absolutely devastating. And when you consider countries like Egypt buys about 85% of their grain from this region. Lebanon in 2020, 80% of its grain from this region, 50% of our grain. Ethiopia, I can go on and on and on. So poor countries are very critically relying on the grains that come from this region. And if they can't get it from there, then you're talking about price spiking. And quite frankly, when you look at the Arab Spring that took place in 2008, 2011, and 12, we have conditions now worse than then. And we're already seeing riots and protests in cities around the world because of inflation and food pricing. And it's only going to get worse, Vassy. It's going to get actually a lot worse.
When you talk about protecting with neutrality, in layman's terms, do you mean allies have to figure out a way to send the military in, for example, to make sure those ports can be open, to make sure ships can come in and out?
Well, we're the humanitarian sector, so we want impartiality and neutrality to be able to move cargo through. How the international community comes to it to make certain that those ports are free to open, I'll leave that strategy to them, but they've got to act. It's not like they can wait 6 months on this. We're talking about the harvest in July and August, so decisions need to be made in the next 30, 60 days to get those ports operating again. Whatever the international community needs to do to operate, to allow those ports to operate, it's got to be done, and it's got to be done now.
Can I ask you, Mr. Beasley, as kind of, one of the primary, if not the primary advocate for some kind of action to that effect, do you honestly have the sense that allies are adequately seized with what you just laid out?
Well, that's why I'm so happy to be talking to you, because I think when leaders hear the reality of what we're facing, because I don't think a lot of leaders understand the comprehensive dynamic, because it's not just a military campaign that's preventing, it's also a blockade of the movement of food and the movement of commercial supplies as well for the rest of the world that Ukraine is critically relying on. And so, in my opinion, you've only got a matter of weeks to resolve this issue. If you don't, you'll have collapse internally, economically. And then that means the farmers are not going to be farming. That means they're not going to be producing food for the people around the world that rely on them, as we have been relying on them for many, many, many years. So number one, we need the water in. Number two, we need access in areas inside Ukraine that we're being blocked from now. And then number three, we need those ports operating, because this is not just a Ukrainian problem. The whole world is going to pay a price if we don't get those ports operating again.
Mr. Beasley, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.